My question is to the Prime Minister and asks, did his Chief of Staff, Wayne Eagleson, advise Parliamentary Service that United Future leader Honourable Peter Dunn had agreed to cooperate with the Henry inquiry and had consented to releasing his electronic phone logs? If so, why?
Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr Speaker, I'm advised the answer is no.
Supplementary question.
Supplementary question, Dr Russell Norman.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Why then did the Speaker advise me in an answer to a written question?
Order. There is no ministerial responsibility for any answer given by the Speaker of this Parliament.
Well, point of order, Mr Speaker. My question is not about your answer. It is about the David Henry inquiry and Wayne Eagleson.
I accept that. So word it in such a way that the Speaker is not brought into the debate.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Is the Prime Minister aware that his Chief of Staff wrote an email to Parliamentary Service authorising the release of data, email data amongst other data, from Peter Dunn? And if so, what authority did his Chief of Staff have to authorise such release?
Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr Speaker, well, I haven't actually seen the email, but I'll accept the member's word that he did that. The authority was the one that was set up when I set up the terms of inquiry, that all ministers and support staff of the government would have seen that the terms of inquiry were quite clear, that phone logs and records would be accessed, as actually I'm sure that member of Parliament would expect of me when we set up an inquiry, that we actually get to the bottom of the issues. If we don't do that, in fact, that member is the first person to claim it's a whitewash.
Supplementary question, Dr Russell Norman.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Is the Prime Minister aware that Mr Dunn was in receipt of the report as the leader of the United Future Party, not as a minister, and that the email logs concerned were his parliamentary email account, not his ministerial email account?
Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Well, Mr Speaker, I'm aware that he was in receipt of the report, and I think it was quite clear that anybody who was in receipt of the report would be subject to that, the terms set up by the inquiry. And I will make the point, Mr Speaker, no particular person, no one indeed at all, ever came to me and argued that the terms of reference were incorrectly set.
Supplementary question.
Supplementary question, Dr Russell Norman.
Was he aware that his Chief of Staff was in contact with Parliamentary Service in order to, let us say, pressure Parliamentary Service to release the information about Mr Dunn?
Well, Mr Speaker, I think
Minister.
The premise of that question is quite incorrect. The terms of conditions and conditions of the inquiry were set out. They were very clear, and anyone in receipt of that information, would need to release that information that was released.
Point of order, Mr Speaker. Point of order, Dr Russell Norman.
Mr Speaker, my question was the Prime Minister aware of it?
So you're speaking to the point of order?
I'm happy to give an answer if I feel I didn't give an answer.
Would the Prime Minister please elaborate on his answer?
Mr Speaker, I can't say I was absolutely aware, but the Chief of Staff acts on my instructions. It would be my expectation that he would have done that.
Supplementary question, Dr Russell Norman.
So, just for the purpose of clarity, was the Prime Minister aware that his Chief of Staff was in contact with Parliamentary Service in order to facilitate the release of Peter Dunn's parliamentary email log?
Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr Speaker, I'd have to check, but for the best of my knowledge, no, I wasn't absolutely aware he was doing that, but I was aware I'd set up the terms of the inquiry, and it would be my expectation in carrying out those terms of inquiries as established by me that my Chief of Staff would then facilitate that taking place.
Supplementary question.
Supplementary question, Dr Russell Norman.
Can the Prime Minister tell us whether his Chief of Staff, the Chief of Staff for the Prime Minister, was aware that the Henry inquiry was accessing information about a journalist?
Well, Mr.
Right
Speaker,
Honourable
I don't have
Prime
that.
Minister.
I don't have that information with me, but I think it's important to understand that, as has been corrected today, in fact, by the Speaker on behalf of Parliamentary Services, in fact, the Henry Inquiry didn't ask for that information. That information was incorrectly sent by Parliamentary Services. In my view, they got it wrong. That was recognised by the Henry Inquiry, and that information was never accessed.
Supplementary.
Supplementary question, Dr Russell Norman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Was his Chief of Staff aware that the Henry Inquiry was accessing a journalist's building movement records?
Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I don't have that information with me.
Supplementary.
Supplementary question, Dr Russell Norman.
Is the Prime Minister entirely comfortable that his Chief of Staff was effectively leaning on Parliamentary Services to release information? What we're aware of is information about Peter Dunn, but potentially also information about a journalist's movements.
Right Honourable Prime Minister can address the
Mr.
question.
Speaker, I completely reject the premise of the question.
Supplementary question, Grant Robertson.
In light of that answer, does the Prime Minister stand by his answer to written question 8179 when he was asked whether his office had directly asked Parliamentary Service for the metadata about Peter Dunn's emails, when he responded, "My office directly asked Parliamentary Services"?
Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Yes, I stand by it.
Supplementary question, the Right Honourable Winston Peters.
Is the Prime Minister saying...
Order.
Is the Prime Minister saying that there is precedent, such as when a Privileges Committee in 2008 demanded of a Member of Parliament his full telephone records, which were happily given over, and that demand was made by 5 political parties, including the United Party, which all of a sudden now finds its information totally sacrosanct?
Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, yes, there potentially is precedent, but what I am saying quite clearly is that I don't believe the release of information about a journalist or their records is appropriate. I don't believe it was part of the terms of the inquiry, and in fact that was backed up by the fact that the information, when it was inadvertently given by Parliamentary Services, was actually never opened and rejected.